Hello, so this is supposed to be an introduction to empire, so I'm going to try and explain to you my understanding of our historical situation and what we should be doing. Um, so the word empire gets tossed around. Usually you'd think about our country as being a democratic republic. Is it becoming an empire? But there's also talk about this, global empire of capitalism, which transcends the state, although the state is still um, a very important actor. But the point is that no single state um, is this empire or the center of this empire, but instead there's this empire of capitalism, which is basically the reproduction of a logic which itself reproduces social relations. Um, and that just means that um, the logic of labor, profit, extraction of resources, and consumption of those resources at an ever faster pace, what we call growth, that this logic has taken hold throughout the entire world. Of course, even though you could speak about this transcendent economic empire, that is still guaranteed by the monopoly on force provided by states. And particularly the United States has enjoyed a very considerable monopoly on violence in the world. The Soviet Union was a competitor, a distant competitor in this. The U.S. was given pretty free reign over much of the world for a lot of the time, notable exceptions like Cuba, North Korea, Iran, Iraq over time. Anyway, these countries prove the exception to the rule because Western capitalism was able to neo-colonize much of the world and lead it into debt crisis, making it dependent on the system of capitalism for loans which it could use to sustain, for those states to sustain themselves. And this happened in South America, this happened in Mexico, this happened in the Caribbean, this happened in Africa, this happened in Eastern Asia during the meltdown in the mid-90s of the Asian tigers. This happened to Japan with its stagnant now 2 decades. This happened to Russia as well when the Soviet Union finally collapsed. It happened to Iraq, Saudi Arabia, Israel, Egypt. All these countries became dependent on the West in order to sustain themselves, both in terms of military aid the United States provided and in terms of the U.S. invading those countries and overthrowing regimes that they didn't like. So in this way, the United States has enjoyed a monopoly on violence, kind of unprecedented in global affairs, both in terms of its breadth, in terms of how much it is able to project its power outside of its own borders through naval power, air power, the Marines, land-based power, etc., satellites, surveillance, etc., the CIA and other clandestine organizations in addition to the above-board military, etc. And it has also enjoyed a monopoly on violence in terms of trade. So that means that the standard of living for those in the U.S. has continued to go up despite the fact that the U.S. has had to take on a lot of debt to do so. If any other country which did not possess the global monopoly on violence that the United States enjoys, if one of those countries had gone into the kind of debt America has, then its economy would quickly become unsustainable. In contrast to this, the U.S., which possessed half the world's wealth at the end of World War II, and only in 1970 really started to be challenged by foreign capitalist countries, even in their own markets. It became accustomed to this high standard of living, ever-increasing amount of consumption, etc. But the problem is that in the 1970s, we run into a problem because other countries are catching up. The U.S. oil production peaks. The U.S. has to leave the gold standard, et cetera, et cetera. And what this means is we basically enter into an era of fake money. The end of this era is signaled by the 2008 financial collapse. It is just not sustainable to have something that's based on nothing. So the point of that is that the American empire is kind of imploding. So you have the economy, which has to run through these banks, which are technically bankrupt. They have no assets except for debt, which will probably not be repaid. The student loan debt is a major debt that might not ever be paid. um, all the rest of these mortgages as though the economy is going to pick up. It may do so, but it also might not. Not to mention um, the fiscal cliff toward which the state is heading, which might necessitate the cutting of welfare programs, which will reduce even more of the population into abject poverty. The average is already 15.7%, excuse me. So basically what we're looking at is that the U.S. empire, um, protected by military force and having to do with economic exchange tilted in favor of the United States, or seen from the more global perspective of the empire of capitalism, being able to sustain itself, its parasitic relationship based on uh, the dependence of the society on the financial institutions, which are unstable to say the least because they are based on the repayment of debt or the classification of debt as an asset. And then based on that, more debt is created. So that logic, if it ultimately fails, which is not clear, then the empire will fall. In addition, there's also military conflicts happening. Obviously, the Middle East is in a conflagration at this time. And kind of broadly in the globe, there's a kind of low intensity conflict going on all the time. States, capitalist states, capitalist states globally are trying to maintain their authority within their own borders as much as they're also trying to control the situation of their country in the world economy. So what I mean is that the United States cracks down on Occupy Wall Street at the same time as it's projecting military power to stifle dissidents or empower dissidents that it wants to empower in other countries. So at the same time, it's trying for internal control as well as external control. But the United States is the strongest central government in the world. Others are a lot less stable, as we can see in the Middle Eastern countries, for instance, where prolonged protests can actually oust somebody from power. We have to see something of a qualitatively different level in the United States to even come close, I think. But the point is that the military conflict in the Middle East is boiling down to whether or not there's going to be this Iran strike. So this Iran strike could, the Iranians, they have a military commander who says it could start World War III. So what we're dealing with is a conflict that could go nuclear so say, nobody knows what's going to happen. So Israel decides it's going to strike Iran. Maybe Iran decides to try and strike Israel preemptively. But if that doesn't happen, maybe Israel hits them with nuclear weapons at first. One of Israel's main objectives will be both to take out Iranian missile capability and also to reduce their anti-aircraft capability. Those are its two main objectives. Who knows which ones it will succeed in? Then say Israel strikes first, Iran has counterstrike, there's Hezbollah, there's Hamas, Syria, and Iran. Syria is rumored to have chemical weapons. Iran may or may not have chemical or biological weapons. Biological weapons are called a poor man's nuclear weapon because although they don't possess the potential of destroying infrastructure in the way a nuclear bomb does and disseminating radiation, biological weapons have improved, let's put that in quotation marks, exponentially, so that by this point they're capable of killing millions of people. Because all you have to do is maximize the spreadability of the disease, etc. Biological warfare is already used around the time of the Black Death. People would throw heads into the castle of their enemy, and now we have genetic engineering, which means we can fundamentally alter the way bacteria function. So that's bad. So they might have biological weapons. Nobody knows what could happen. What if Iran has sleeper cells in America, releases biological weapons, da-da-da. Who knows whether a mutually assured destruction situation exists. And it's not really in the interest of any state to give that away, because if Iran were to say that we have this, it would only make military intervention by the West even more of a sure thing. So, but not only is there Iran, you're talking about China and Russia. Meanwhile, tensions between China and Japan, a major ally of America with whom it has a Mutual Defense Act, they're fighting over these islands. So tensions around the world are going up among all the great powers. Russia continues to be in conflict with America over Syria. NATO is very much trying to pass resolutions which will authorize military intervention into Syria. And at the same time, there's a very militant wing in the United States which is calling for bombardment of Syria and also Iran. Um, and it's a play. It's a. This is an illustration of the fact that there is no. You cannot support a state in this, is what I'm trying to say, because. Am I going? Excuse me. I didn't know that the video was continuing. You cannot support a state in this because, say, the question of Syria. So I don't support the NATO because I think that they are seeking to intervene not for humanitarian reasons but for political, economic, military, strategic reasons, um, following kind of a domino strategy where they hope to collapse ever greater powers, destabilizing the next greatest power. So the U.S. obviously in the current era is faced with two gargantuan obstacles, Russia and China, in its pursuit of world hegemony. Um, and Iran is a minor, well, it's a stepping stone. It's a pretty major threat because Iran has access to some of the world's largest natural gas and oil reserves. It's also the home of the largest Shia Sunni Muslim population. Oh, excuse me, Shia Muslim population. Like the Muslim community is divided most broadly into two sects, Shia and Sunni. Sunnis control, or Sunnis are more populous and are in most Middle Eastern or most traditionally considered Muslim nations. Notably, Saudi Arabia is a Sunni power. Iraq has both Sunni and Shia, as well as Iran. There are Sunni within Iran, but the point is that the government is controlled by the Shia. So this is the world we're faced with. A world where World War III could start at any time. You know, potentially, if Israel bombs Iran and Iran turns out to have biological weapons of a great disastrous capability, we could all be dead soon. Um, and this could all be part of a depopulation agenda by the elites. So we could all be dead. On the other hand, at the very least, we're faced with an evil empire on all fronts because there is no state. As I was saying, you can't support any state in this. So not NATO, but also not Russia, because Russia is an oligarchy as well. And while non-hegemonic powers always have like underdog status, so it kind of makes sense. It feels good to be like, yeah, Russia. I mean, but it feels good to say that because they're resisting the bad guys, but at the same time, they're bad guys as well, and they crush dissidents and do all kinds of shit. So, like, you have to keep all that in mind because, like, I don't want Chinese state capitalism to dominate any more than I want the United States state capitalism to dominate. And so, what we really want to be doing is networking with dissidents internationally so that we can produce a resistance which is not national, but also not only against corporations and also not only critical. Because as much as we must denounce all the forms of oppression and exploitation which exist not only in our nation, but in the whole world, at the same time as we must do that, we must also have a positive program that we might be able to share so that we can germinate good ideas and, you know, set fires in people's hearts that will eventually unite and ignite the whole world in flame. I don't mean that literally, but in, you know, boom, 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 boom. I love you. We're in this together. Bye. Comment me.